I can't say for certain when the idea of killing Sarah first crossed my mind. It could have been that night Hannah showed me pictures of Sarah's journal. It could have been the night Preston Jarvis disappeared. It could have been during the hellish weeks that followed, while we walked on eggshells around our own house, praying to any god that would listen to deliver us from the nightmare we had found ourselves in. For a while, nothing seemed real. Could Sarah, my Sarah, kill people? No way. Never. But she had. Pictures of her from school, smiling happily back at us from in front of a painted woodland background hung in the hallway. I would pass them, seeing her bright eyes, and ask myself if I truly believed that little girl was capable of the atrocities we had accused her of. It was simply not possible. But it was. The idea sat in the back of my head, festering like an infected boil for weeks, until it suddenly burst, spreading its contents all over my mind. I hated myself for thinking it, for even allowing the thoughts to come into my mind so clearly as that, but I hated myself even more for failing to see another option. There was no psychologist, no corrections officer, no court that could contain her. If Sarah wanted to be free to do what she wished, then it was just a matter of willing it so. Perhaps if there was a correct dosage of some drug we could give her that could dampen these abilities, then maybe there was a chance to reason with her. But if he got it wrong, it would cost the lives of everyone involved and countless others. The only way to ensure everyone's safety was to remove Sarah from the board altogether. She was too powerful, too psychotic, to be able to live a happy, healthy life. She had always been a scourge on the neighbourhood, no matter how much love we had shown her. And for 13 years. We had been proven time and time again that the rest of the world would shut her out and fear and hate her. Perhaps that fate would be the best for her as well. I knew it wasn't true, but that was the lie I told myself to get myself to sleep. When I brought this idea up to Hannah, I think a part of me wanted her to hate me for it. I wanted her to slap me across the face and tell me how awful I was for even suggesting such a thing, but she would give me no such satisfaction. I had taken her to dinner under the guise of wanting a romantic evening out of the house. After we'd ordered our entrees, however, Hannah called me out. "What is it?" she asked, a tone of concern and dread in her voice. I frowned. "Don't give me that look," she said, a bit more harshly than I think she intended. "You got us out of the house so we could talk about Sarah, didn't you? Has something else happened?" No, I said, shaking my head. "Nothing like that." She took a sip of her water. "But it is something about Sarah, isn't it?" I collected myself for a minute, drinking about half my glass of ice water as I did so, then told Hannah my idea. My heart felt like it was going to beat right out of my chest and onto the plate of Alfredo I'd ordered. Hannah didn't speak for several long minutes. I tried to eat my meal, but at that moment it seemed like the least appetizing thing in the world. When she did speak, her voice was low, quiet, and bubbling over with regret. "I think you're right." I wasn't sure if I was going to laugh or sob. The two balanced each other out, and instead I sat there stoically. "Did you hear me?" Hannah asked. Tears were welling in her eyes and the corners of her mouth were twitching downward. I nodded, still unable to speak. My throat was burning. We sat for hours in that restaurant, eventually found our stomachs after some time, and were able to put at least a little food down. It was there that we began to hatch our plan. The first part of the plan was to get our neighbours on board, at least Bob from across the street and Tammy next door. They were the most likely of anyone to see or notice anything suspicious. We told ourselves that if either Bob or Tammy refused to help us, or at least corroborate the story we would craft, then we would call the whole thing off. I rehearsed what I would say dozens of times before I found myself on Bob's front porch with a plate of cookies Hannah had made. Bob smiled when he opened the door and saw the cookies, but when he met my eyes, his smile collapsed. "Come on in," Bob said. "You look like you've got something to talk about." He led me in and around the corner, where he had 2 maroon recliners. The house smelled of roses. "Can I get you a drink?" Bob asked, but already he was shuffling into the kitchen. Sure, I answered, knowing well that if I had declined his offer, Bob would still come out with 2 beers anyway. I heard the tinkling of glass and the familiar sound of the cup being removed. Then Bob came back around the corner. He handed me a bottle, then sat down in the adjacent recliner, sighing. Now, what's on your mind, son? I tried to swallow, but my mouth was too dry. I took a sip of beer and began. Sarah's not well, I said. Bob raised his eyebrows. Is it the cancer? No, nothing like that, I said. She's got something wrong with her mind. I'm sure you've noticed that she's different from the other children, and that she makes people feel, well, uncomfortable. Bob nodded. I swallowed another sip of beer. Hannah and I have done what we can to help her, but things have gotten past a point where we can offer help, where anyone can offer help. I paused, searching Bob's face. What I was about to say next would condemn me. Do you remember that day Bear got hit by the U-Haul? That was Sarah. She's able to do things like that, but also much more terrible things. I think that's why people feel the way they do when they're around her. They can sense that she's different, that she's dangerous. A few things have happened, I'd rather not get into the details, but I will if you need me to, that have brought Hannah and myself to the conclusion that... Bob held up his hand. My stomach twisted around like a coiled snake. Did I ever tell you about my time in the service? I shook my head, so taken aback by this sudden change of topic that I momentarily lost my voice. I was stationed near Khe Sanh in '68 and saw more bloodshed than any man should see in his life. Thousands of people died that year. Many nights I would fall asleep to the sounds of gunfire in the distance and wake up to the sounds of men screaming. I can't say I didn't take lives. God help me, I took far more than I care to say, but there were others. He trailed off, and for a moment I wondered if he would continue his story. When he spoke again, his voice was rough and his eyes were misted by tears of the past, when we were in boot camp together, and he was my only lasting friend throughout the entire nightmare. When the killing started, I didn't think I could be more terrified, but when I looked at Paul, I saw something that scared me even more than the thought of losing my life to the enemy. I could see pleasure in Paul's eyes every time he fired his weapon at another man. He enjoyed it. He loved it. He told stories of his exploits, his murders, as if they were hunting tales. He'd talk about how many gorillas he killed, like they were nothing but a few low-point bucks, and with every word he spoke, his self-satisfaction grew. As the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, that look in his eyes stayed, the stories he told became more horrendous, and the man that he once was seemed to be lost forever. I saw him open fire on men, women, and children, relishing every final breath he took for his own. I saw him commit atrocities that I will never speak of. We got our transfer papers one night, and where most men would feel joy and excitement to finally leave the bloodshed, I felt horror. Horror for those that would cross paths with my once dear friend. But I had no doubt in my mind that the killing may have stopped for me, but for Paul it had only just begun. It was a game to him now, and he would continue to play. The last life I ever took was that of my best friend in the jungle of Vietnam on the day before we were sent to transfer. We had stumbled across a family of travellers along the road, and where I saw people, men, women and children, Paul saw nothing but lambs for the slaughter. He brought his rifle up to his shoulder, and I shot him in the back of the head. I don't wonder if I did the right thing, but if I'd done the right thing sooner, how many innocent lives would have been saved? Bob held the bottle to his lips and finished his beer, then stood up and went to the kitchen for another. I love that little girl of yours, he called from the kitchen. The note of pain that had developed in his voice now seemed to seep through the walls. I too want what's best for her. I won't hear the question you came here to ask. Such things are better left unsaid, but I think you'll find I've answered it nonetheless. Indeed he had. Hannah and I have both been avoiding watching the news in the house since Sarah arrived home, nervous that something like the news of the red trailer truck stop would come on and our thoughts would betray us. All it took was one glimpse of that truck stop, and I knew we wouldn't be able to help immediately thinking about that night. It was like having a gun to my head and watching a documentary about lions and trying not to think about a lion, even for a moment, lest the trigger be pulled. The truth is that we had passed that truck stop 2 times that night, once with our little girl buckled up in the back seat, her lifeless head lolling around as the car hit bumps in the road, and once with nothing but silence and a queer sense of relief filling the car. It was the closest sign of civilization from where we had left Sarah, and would have been the first place anyone would stop if they had a teenage hitchhiker in the passenger seat with no memory of how she got there. The morning of the day Sarah showed up on our doorstep was when that short order cook had discovered a truck stop full of bodies. That was no coincidence. Sarah had been there. But what had caused her to kill those people? Had she been attacked? It's possible, but I didn't think so. There were no signs of violence at all, at least according to the news, and I would imagine if someone had attacked her, there would either be no body at all, or their body would be smeared across the walls. I really think that it boils down to 2 scenarios. Either Sarah had no control of what happened, or she had complete control and simply didn't care. Like a child, stomping on an anthill, regardless of which way that door swings, it still leads to a room with a nuclear missile, and I'd been sleeping right next door. I'd been debating with myself for a while about whether to bring the news of the red trailer truck stop up with Hannah. The secret feels as if it will consume me, but I fear it will be too much for Hannah to take. She was never as good at keeping things from Sarah as I was, and she's already been trying to keep an enormous one from breaking down the barriers in her mind. But if something is to be done about Sarah being around, and equally as dangerous as before, then I'm not sure I'm capable of carrying that burden alone. The answer, as it so happens, came to me this morning in the form of the newspaper. We don't subscribe to the newspaper, so when Hannah slid it across the breakfast table, I was a bit perplexed. "Found some pretty great coupons in here," she said uncharacteristically. "You should give them a look at work later, and we can make a shopping list." Sarah was still in bed, but even still, it was wise to continue to keep up the charade. "You got it," I said, finishing my coffee in 2 gulps and grabbing my bag. "I'm gonna head out now." I kissed Hannah and left the house quickly, knowing that the longer I stayed there, the more likely my curiosity would seep through the thin veneer of my thoughts about work and what to do for lunch later. I drove down the street and parked in a gas station a few blocks away. I had half an hour before I needed to be at work, so there was plenty of time to read whatever Hannah was trying to get me to read. I was about to look for the coupon section, thinking she'd give me a clue, but as it turns out, what I needed to read was on the front page. Experts believe series of unexplained deaths may be connected. Many have long suspected a connection between the recent series of unexplained deaths, starting with those individuals at the red trailer truck stop, and most recently occurring yesterday in the case of Robert Sullivan, but it wasn't until yesterday evening that representatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially announced that they are researching possible connection between these deaths. Including the 8 victims of the red trailer truck stop, there have been over 20 deaths that have baffled both police and medical examiners. If there had been any identified cause of death, FBI Representative Todd Hull states, "We would have entertained the possibility of a mentally ill individual or a group of ill individuals harming the public. Right now, we are researching the possible and likely connection between these deaths and urge the public to contact local medical professionals immediately with any unexplained changes in mood, activity level, awareness level, diet, and so forth. This does not appear to be related to the drinking water, nor an airborne contaminant, but I assure you, we are exploring every possible avenue." Hull further urges the public to be vigilant and to pay close attention to loved ones. Probably the most baffling part of this whole case is the lack of public engagement, Hull says. Not a single victim has been reported to police by close friends or family for several days. I cannot stress enough that vigilance is key to ensuring the safety of ourselves and our loved ones. Hull, of course, is referring to the fact that each death has been reported only by neighbours or passers-by. Authorities have reported family and close friends acting shocked by the news of the death of their loved ones, even though those loved ones may have been in plain sight for several days prior to a wellness check by police. As I read this article, it felt as if my head was floating underwater. Sarah hadn't stopped at the truck stop, and it now seemed as if her reach was even further than it was 3 years ago. Robert Sullivan, Bob as I knew him, lived 10 miles away on the other side of town. There, sitting in the gas station parking lot with the newspaper sitting across my lap and steering wheel, I began to cry.